All right, well, small businesses affected by recent bushfires will today now have access to new grants and low-interest loans to help them get back on their feet. The cost of the program is not yet known, but the money will come from the federal government's $2 billion National Bushfire Recovery Fund.
Small business dealt a double blow. First the fires and then the subsequent exodus during the peak tourist season.
The biggest crisis that those small businesses face right now is their cash flow.
The government now stepping in to get business back on its feet, offering up a multi-million-dollar support package from its $2 billion recovery fund.
The first step is the hardest when responding to the crisis, to get yourself up off the mat, to actually be able to look forward and say, my business has a future.
Immediate support will be offered for up to 192,000 small businesses and sole traders in the worst affected regions. The measures include government grants up to $50,000 tax-free, concessional loans up to $500,000. $3.5 million will go towards a dedicated phone support line with financial counsellors on the other end. And tax relief measures mean businesses will have longer to get their paperwork in order. The package finalised after a week of roundtables in Canberra, business groups broadly welcoming the assistance.
That's why this package is so important. Get cash into the hands of those small business people as soon as possible.
Unlike other announcements to emerge from the government's recovery fund, the cost of this small business package is unclear. Also unclear, the impact all this support will have on the budget.
I'm not in a position to give a firm answer to that question because the full economic impact is still uncertain.
The opposition welcoming the package but calling for clarity about who is and isn't eligible.
It's really important that small businesses know whether they can actually access this support.
Both Labor and the Coalition concede, though, the speed of the support is as important as the assistance itself. David Shiraz, Sky News, Canberra.
Well, it's obvious to everyone, whether you live in Australia or not, that the bushfire crisis has delivered a few heavy blows to the Morrison government over the summer. A news poll released last week showed just how much damage has been done, as we saw an 8-point drop in the Prime Minister's approval ratings, falling from 45% in December to 37%, allowing Anthony Albanese to sneak up the ladder and for the first time take the lead as preferred Prime Minister. So where to now for the Morrison government? Can they fight their way back from what's been a damaging period, not only in fire terms, of course, for our country, but also the Coalition's political capital? And where to this year for Labor? Quietly, in the midst of all this noise on bushfires and climate change, as you heard me in my editorial, well, Labor are remaking their emissions targets, out now to 2050 from the earlier 2030 deadline. For his analysis, joining me now from the Sydney studio, one of the best in the business, the Australian's editor-at-large, Mr Paul Kelly. Paul, I'm delighted to have you on the show. This is the first show for the year, first show for the decade, and I'm interested to see where your assessments are, both of the Prime Minister and the Coalition more broadly, and their counterparts in Anthony Albanese and Labor, after what's been a pretty tough summer for Australians, notwithstanding a tough summer for the government.
There's no doubt, Peter, that Scott Morrison has been damaged by the bushfires. The news poll showed that. There's a blow to the government standing, but there's a personal blow to Scott Morrison's standing and authority as Prime Minister. Can he recover? Well, one of the tests of Prime Ministers, as you know, is how they cope with adversity, how they can recover when things go wrong. This will be a fascinating test for Scott Morrison.
And we know that he has confounded his critics, Paul, in the past. No one gave him much of a chance last May. He's one of the best political strategists we've seen in a national leader. But there's one thing to running a political campaign, which is where his history is. And there's another thing when you've taken, a really, significant personal hit about your conduct and potentially your character out of the events of the last couple of months. Now, I don't think he could do more in policy terms. He appears to be hitting all the right notes in terms of response from the Commonwealth. What does he need to do you think, in the next few weeks, heading into all the other business that dominates the start of the parliamentary year, like budget preparations? What do we want to see from the PM?
Well, I think what Scott Morrison has got to do is he's got to rethink the rhetoric. he's got to keep up the plan of action in terms of responding to the bushfires. I think he needs to brand himself as a practical man, as a realist, as a Prime Minister who recognises the scale of the problem, but is prepared to respond in a practical and realistic way across the entire board. I think that's the sort of position he should look for. That means getting cash into the hands of people who need it, and it also means branding himself as a Prime Minister committed to renewal and reconstruction. So I think that's the sort of framework he needs. He's not there yet. He's working towards that. Then, of course, you've got the big economic challenge, and the question facing the government there is how much damage will be done to GDP as a result of the bushfires.
Yeah, look, one of the big tests for the government obviously is the upcoming budget in May. We know about this time in the cycle. There's all the expenditure review meetings. The Treasurer is looking for savings. Ministers are looking for more dough. How are the Prime Minister's colleagues, those that are out of this issue specifically but more broadly, how are they working? Because I think one of the problems for Morrison is he's got a couple of people behind him, I think, that are pulling their weight. Others, you've got to query whether there's too many own goals, and we'll go to Bridget McKenzie on that point, that are hitting him with some friendly fire.
Look, that's a really good question. And in a sense, the dilemma for Scott Morrison from the time he became Liberal leader in August 2018 was that he had to really carry the burden himself. He did that brilliantly during the course of the election campaign last May. But what we need to see with the Morrison government is we need to see more talent in depth. And when you start looking at this cabinet, when you start looking at the ministry, I think there's a talent problem. So there needs to be a more strategic approach here from the government to ensure that ministers are pulling their weight. Then you've got the second problem you talked about. Bridget McKenzie is now going to be under fire. The campaign against her will intensify when the Parliament comes back. Labor will have plenty of ammunition to use, and it showed in the campaign it waged against Angus Taylor that it's got a capacity to pinpoint these weak ministers and really do significant damage.
I mean, one of the things that came out of this debate on bushfires, and I'll leave it after this question, but one of the things I think that's come out very clearly is the lack of clarity around the lines between the Commonwealth and the states. Ever since Federation, bushfires have been the responsibility of state governments, and indeed over time local councils as well. It's not been something that has been a responsibility of the Commonwealth. A number of years ago, you'll remember John Howard got involved with the lease of an Elvis firefighting aerial asset. There has been now some call on Commonwealth resources for assets, particularly aerial assets, but now very much this summer shows you that when things are tough, Australians expect leadership out of the Prime Minister, even if it's not his responsibility. One of the things I think that's really needed here is a national hazard reduction plan. There is a whole lot of commitments made at state level coming out of Royal Commissions. We saw in the case of Victoria, only 1/3 of the burns recommended by the Royal Commission were met last year. Do you think this is somewhere, if the states want to make it the Commonwealth's problem, rather than dodge the issue, isn't this where the Prime Minister can get back some credibility?
Well, you've identified some critical issues here. One of the lessons from the bushfire crisis is that the Australian people will look to the Prime Minister. They will look to the national government, and they'll do this even though the prime responsibility rests with the states. Now, this trapped Scott Morrison over the last several weeks, because essentially what he did was he wasn't sufficiently proactive, because in a sense he recognised it was the state responsibility, and quite a lot of the advice going to him was that the fires were being managed properly. He then recognised that he had to change, he had to get more proactive, he had to assume a greater responsibility for the national government in this issue and for himself as Prime Minister. And so he involved the Defence Forces, and since then he's indicated that there needs to be a referral of constitutional powers. Now, in other words, what he's done is he's opened up the whole issue of federation and how the federation plays out in terms of these national crises such as bushfires and floods. This is going to have to be worked through, and it's not going to be an easy issue for Morrison, but essentially he's now got to stick with the position he adopted and recognise that the national government and the Prime Minister will be expected to do more and show more leadership in these situations. That's going to be one of the great takeouts from these bushfires. The question is how it happens.
Paul, you touch on there a very vexed issue, and that's what I'll call the call-out powers. This is the use for viewers at home of the Australian Defence Force in civilian, basically, which is what bushfires are, civilian crises. Now, I know from the Lint siege, Paul Kelly, you will remember that at the time, the New South Wales Police and the Premier said that they had it in hand, notwithstanding the fact that the Prime Minister wanted to make available commandos out of the ADF base at Holdsworthy. That was declined. I say rejected, but I'll be kind. That was declined. And of course, a Prime Minister can't deploy the ADF on any street in Australia in a civilian context, otherwise, you know, unless Australia, the nation state, is being threatened, unless it has the approval of the Premier. Daniel Andrews in Victoria, very quick to request the PM send the ADF into Mallacoota and Eastern Gippsland. Not so in New South Wales. Do you see that there's now going to be some change with these call-out powers?
Well, there's got to be change, and you quite correctly identify the fact that we had different premiers taking different positions on whether the ADF should in fact be involved. Traditionally, often state governments and state leaders, state premiers say, well, we can look after things. So I think what's got to happen here is there's clearly going to be a new arrangement, and the new arrangement must be based on concord between the Commonwealth and the states. So whatever happens from this point in time in terms of the use of the ADF in the future, in terms of these national crises and future bushfires, there's got to be an arrangement sorted out which everybody signs up to, all governments.
All right, well, I carefully read through the 5 volumes of the Victorian Royal Commission into the 2009 bushfires. 173 odd people were killed, hundreds and hundreds of homes were razed. In those recommendations, they wanted to set a target of hazard reduction burns of 5% of national parks and forests in Victoria. Now, last year, only a third of that target was met. It was one of the key recommendations out of the Royal Commission. How is it that Daniel Andrews is Teflon on this issue in a way that the Prime Minister, who has actually no responsibility for these burns, is being held responsible?
Well, this is another very interesting question. The point to make here is that the states were responsible for these emergency managements and for the response to the bushfires, but the Prime Minister got blamed. And I think he got blamed because he got off to a very bad start with the overseas trip. He shouldn't have done that. He should have learnt from John Howard in relation to that. And after that, he was always on the defensive, and his critics in the Labor Party and in the media were able to insert that wedge and use it very, very effectively against Scott Morrison. I think the key to his response now is what I said earlier. He must present himself as a practical Prime Minister, completely aware of all the problems, able to see the problems with a clear eye, not through ideological lenses of one side or the other, operate as a realist who is prepared to respond promptly and quickly and commit funds to solve these problems.
All right, and just before we go to the break, Anthony Albanese. Now, I can smell a PR campaign like anyone here, and I've seen a lot of soft stories about his recent marriage breakup, his conversion to the big job of leader, how he's dealing with his troops. There's been obviously the movement over the weekend in relation to the emissions target being pushed out by another 20 years to 2050. And there was, very interestingly, the first press conference that I can recall for some time with Anthony Albanese standing next to Bill Shorten, all about the NDIS and the bushfire crisis. Has Labor very cannily used this bushfire to get back in the game?
I think they have, and I think one of the points to make here is that Anthony Albanese's image is looking quite comfortable and quite sound at the moment, And indeed, the news poll showed, given the damage done to Scott Morrison's image, that the Labor leader was looking very strong by comparison. One of the fascinating issues now will be what happens in the polls as we go through the year. Will Labor entrench its modest state of the party's lead over the government? Will Albanese maintain a lead over Morrison or not? Now, that could be a trap for Labor because, of course, we saw in the last parliament that Labor was ahead in the polls and got complacent and misread the situation. I think Albanese, in that sense, will be far smarter than Shorten. But the point I'd make is that it's one thing for him to cultivate his image, which he's doing effectively. It's another thing for him to effectively lead a Labor Party into a policy reconstruction, which he's got to do. That won't be easy because essentially he said he'll move the party back to the centre in significant ways. Well, there'll be a lot of division in Labor about how it's actually to move back to the centre, what are the policy changes that'll be made to move it back to the centre, and whether Albanese can actually do this effectively without polarising the party.
Paul Kelly, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Peter.